Everyone, welcome to Sociology of the Body. This is the 8-week online asynchronous course that you've just signed up for. I am the professor for the course. My name is Kyle Green. You can call me Professor Green. You can call me Kyle. You can call me Dr. Green, although that's my least favorite. You might wonder why I'm wearing a hat in this video. One of the reasons is that I keep my house kind of cold. The second reason you might wonder is perhaps I'm a magician and I'm doing some sort of magic trick. You might say perhaps he has a rabbit under this hat. In fact, I have no rabbit under this hat, but I do have a hair. So let's think about why we would be studying something like the body within sociology. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of sociology and why it hasn't been a topic of study. I'm also going to think a little bit about how sociologists might study the body. But the first thing to think about, and I think this is always important in any sociology class that you take or any sociological thing you read, is why is it interesting to you? Why is it interesting to contemporary society at this particular moment? If we look at the world we live in now, there have been a ton of cultural shifts that have tied identity increasingly to the body. We have technological breakthroughs that makes it easier to manipulate flesh in manners that really once would have filled science fiction novels. It used to be there were a few parts of your body that you would get manipulated through enhancement. Now it's literally everything. If you look at models, you can think about how legs are reconstructed, people get calf implants, people get their nose redone, people get Botox, people get hair transplants, people get every part of their body modified. It's possible in ways we never would have imagined before. We can also think about how there's reminders of this that surround us at every turn. If you look at advertisements when you go on websites or in your email, you see natural herbal supplements that promise for you to be stronger, to be faster, to live longer, to be better at anything you can imagine you want to be better at, to sleep well, to increase your libido. Sexual procedures guaranteed to impress your sexual partners. All those type of things are happening constantly around us. And sometimes this is in public spaces, but a lot of times it's just on the phone that we pick up, right? It's on our social media. It's on any site that we go to. If you go to a grocery store and you walk down the checkout lane and you look at a magazine, you're going to see celebrities, models, athletes demonstrating their airbrushed body to you, right? This is going to be this constant thing. You're going to see magazines advertising a new workout or diet, and it's going to make all these promises. So these are all these shifts that make us pay more attention to the body or demand that we pay more attention to it. We can look at the TV shows that we watch. When we think about reality shows, we've seen a lot of shows that are specifically about ways to modify the body. I don't actually know if the show's on anymore, but there were two shows that were popular a few years ago. One was, what was it called? Nip and Tuck, which was specifically about surgery. And there's also Extreme Makeover. Oh, and you also had something like The Biggest Loser, right? All these things are about extreme transformations to the body. These are even the things that we watch where it's turned into something we actually pay to consume. Other people change their bodies. And in doing that, what does this do to our own perception? We also can't ignore the class aspect of this, right? This stuff costs money. Safer surgeries, safer modifications cost more money. People will literally take tourism trips and go to other countries where there is better plastic surgery and more affordable plastic surgery. People make specific trips to South Korea or to Brazil to have certain parts of their body modified, right? And so these are just, we're not even getting into scholarly research. We're just thinking about all these trends that have taken place in society. The other thing that we can think about is how even in the labor force, we've seen a shift, right? More and more, what does it mean for machines to replace the body? And for the bodies that still work to either work in positions where they don't use their bodies at all and are simply on the computer, or to just be these kind of physical basic labor where we're doing jobs that may soon be replaced by machines. So again, questions about the body become something that we have to pay attention to. The other thing that I want to point out is we've seen in what I would call greater equality in regards to the body, or maybe a democratization of pressure oriented around the body. Now that sounds like a good thing, right? We've, for years, whether in sociology, psychology, or gender studies, attention has been brought to the different ways that women and girls' bodies have been the target of media and just social pressure. And we've seen all the disorders that emerge from that. right? We've seen the incredible how common it is for people to have eating disorders, for people to have body dysmorphia. And so when you hear me say that there's increased equality, that sounds like a good thing, right? However, what studies have shown is that high school boys are actually catching up at a much faster rate. Not that we see less eating disorders, less body dysmorphia, but rather that boys are catching up to girls in this way. So not something to celebrate, but instead another way to say, hey, we should pay attention to this thing happening in society. Why are there so many unhealthy diets? Why are there so many extreme exercise regimens? Why are people taking supplements which are not safe? Right? Why is it that women still have pressure to be smaller, even while being muscular to some degree, and men want to be larger, right? Why are there different pressures, but still pressure is being exerted on both group? The other thing that's really important is we can't ignore that the ways that this ties into questions about age and questions about race. The ideal body is not accessible to all. The ideal body has particular skin colors depending on what media you're consuming. The ideal body has specific age requirements, which also intersects with gender, right? So we have all these different visions of the perfect body, but we can't just act like it's equally available to everyone. The Western ideal of beauty is a dominant thing, as we'll see in some of the readings for this course. It has become one of our major exports. If you look at one of the most dominant skin product or the dominant body-related products in the world, it's skin lightening cream, right? This is through the Caribbean, it's through Africa, it's through Asia. This desire to have lighter skin. Sales of facial creams and lotions have climbed to over $3 billion a year worldwide. And a great deal of that is related to trying to fit the Western ideal of beauty. You can see this in a ton of other examples. One of the notes that I wrote down is that it's estimated in Korea 50% of girls are now having Western eyelid enhancement surgeries. This is a pretty outrageous number. 1 out of 2 people, right? 1 out of 2 girls. So these are all these different reasons that we should be paying attention to the body. The thing that we have to consider, and at this point, most of you have taken sociology classes before, but in the majority of sociology classes, the body is relatively absent. The actual experience that we have as humans is the thing that's missing. And we're not going to spend a ton of time in this class because it's not a theory class, technically, going back through the history of sociology. That's not the thing I want you to take away. We're not going to spend a ton of time going back through the history of sociology, thinking about why there has been this silence. But it is worth, especially for sociology majors, to briefly consider why, as sociologists studying social life, we've been so bad at focusing on the body when, as I was just setting up, it's such an important topic to consider. The first thing is that early sociologists were trying to distinguish themselves from rival disciplines. Sociology is relatively new, right? So sociology is coming along in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Biology is already dominant. Psychology is already dominant. So most famously, Emile Durkheim is saying, we're going to study this thing called society. We're going to study this thing at the level of a social fact. Or you have someone like Weber, right, who's saying the things we study in sociology are social action that doesn't come from habit, that doesn't come from emotion. So both of them are specifically doing this to try to differentiate themselves and create a place for sociology, right? So that's the first point. The founders of the discipline were trying to establish a discipline, so they had to say, here's how we differ from those other places where you could also do research. The other thing that's important, if you think about the founders of the discipline, whether you think of Karl Marx, whether you think of Max Weber, Emile Durkheim, and I would argue W.E. Du Bois should be included as well as one of the founders of the discipline. If you think of any of the four, they're looking at things at this large mass scale. They're looking at mass urbanization. They're looking at the mechanization of labor. They're looking at the decline of religion. Du Bois is looking at this large shift in where different racial populations live in the United States and eventually this global diaspora. That's all moving away from the individual actor. So again, this is why you don't focus on the body, because they were trying to do it at a different type of level. If you're looking at the Industrial Revolution, it's very much about the body, but that's not the level they were trying to theorize. The other thing that's important, and this is one of my biggest critiques of sociology, is the methods that were being used, the methods that were being celebrated, were intentionally designed to remove the body. And this is following in a long tradition in Western philosophy. Sociologists were trying to separate themselves from the messy, or what they would say the messy and corporeal, to gain access to objective ideas. Durkheim even talked about the ideal researcher being a floating brain in a jar that could just observe the world and not let their senses get in the way. Now, this also plays into the next point, which is, I think, the fourth point and my final point for why sociology hasn't thought about the body is early sociologists were almost exclusively men, right? You could argue that this played a huge part in prioritizing mind over body, or with this idea that the body is this messy container which has to be kind of removed. This is this Western tradition of thinking about women being more attached to their bodies, women's bodies being more emotional, less controlled. And if you look at where appreciation of the body has come from, a lot of it comes from feminist theory that's pointed out we can't just be objective observers. We're people who contain bodies, we're people who interact with the world. This shapes the way we see things. So again, you don't have to remember all this. I'm hoping it sets the stage for what we're going to do, but the body, as I'm going to argue, is central to what we do in society. It's central to how we experience society, and there's a reason it hasn't been talked about enough. And when you go back through those theories of any of the classical theorists, that's often the point they get up to, right? Marx talks about the way that we feel alienated from labor. He gets to the point of almost explaining how our body relates to the workforce, but then he stops there. It's kind of this important silence, and that's what we're going to explore this semester. All right, so we've just thought a little bit about why sociologists haven't done a good job of thinking about the body, or at least centralizing the body in the way we study the world. The question then becomes, as we move into the 80s, even more in the 90s, and then progressively more and more, starting to pay attention to the body, what are the different ways that sociologists could do that? So there's lots of different approaches. There's lots of different theories you could draw on. There's lots of different topics you could look at, right? You could be someone who studies sports. You could be someone who studies labor. You could be someone who studies technology. You could focus specifically on gender and sex. You could focus specifically on race. There's all these different ways that you could approach studying the body. I like to argue that you can group them into three different approaches. We won't spend a ton of time on this semester, but as you go through each week, it might be useful to reflect back on these three ideas, these three categories, and think about how what you're reading, what you're listening to, or what you're watching fits into that. As we're going to discuss in the next welcome video where I talk about the assignments, you have to do a write-up at the end of the week. It could be a really good way to orient your write-up. So you don't have to do that, but it's something to consider. So I like to think that the three different ways that you can approach studying the body and society from a sociological perspective can be thought of simply as the body, bodies, or embodiment. If you're looking at, let's start with just in order. If you're thinking about sociology of the body, that means what you're going to be doing is looking at the way all these different types of power or authority or expertise shape and define how we understand what the body is. It could be you're looking at the medical industry and medical ideas. How do they establish what the proper body is? How do they establish what the normal body is? How do they establish what the healthy body is? Who are the studies done on, right? How is that information transferred down to how we understand what a body is? It could be looking at politics and the law and how they relate to the body. It could be looking at the media. All these different things establish what a body is, how we understand what a body is, and in doing so, a power is being implemented, right? So that's one way to approach things. A lot of times when we think about sociology of the body, it could be focused on something like media studies, discourse analysis. It could be looking at large data sets, but the focus is on the body as an object of power. This is in contrast to the second approach, bodies. If you're looking at bodies, what I mean by that is thinking about how groups of bodies come together. So that would be something you would see traditionally and maybe more in anthropology, right? Thinking about how subcultures exist, how people organize around a certain activity. If you're doing this type of research, you would commonly see something like an ethnography. I'm going to go and study my own research. I'm going to go and study people in mixed martial arts gyms, right? And think about how they come together, what activities they engage in, how they themselves define who they are, how they see other people as part of the group or not part of the group. If you're studying something like fashion and you're doing it as sociology of the body, you would look at how media establishes what the proper fashion is. If you're approaching it from the perspective of bodies, you could think about how people come together based on the clothing they wear, how you exchange meaning, that kind of symbolic interaction approach. The third approach is embodiment. This is the approach that probably gets the least attention. I think it's one of the most exciting things. I do this a lot in my own work as well. Embodiment says, okay, we're studying how society relates to the body. And the way we're doing this is saying the way we experience the world, the way we experience social things is through having a body. That's our sensing organ. You can't talk about any experience you have without talking about the body as the thing that absorbs that information. So if you're talking about, if you want to talk about something like racial discrimination, right? One way would be look at laws. One way would be to look at inequalities related to housing. Another way would to say, what does it mean to experience a body that is labeled in particular ways? What does it mean to have a certain skin color and have people perceive you in a certain way? And how does that affect your perception of the world and your perception of yourself? What does it mean if you're studying something like sport, right? And you're talking about girls' access to youth sport. What does it actually mean to play that thing? That's part of the story. And that's one of the reasons it's left out is it's really hard data to access. And you could think about all the different reasons. But so those are the three approaches, right? We've got the body, which is thinking about how power is exerted. We talk about bodies, which is how people group together. And we talk about embodiment, which is how we actually experience the world. They can overlap, right? Good research can potentially look at all three. In my own research on mixed martial arts, which we'll talk about later in the semester, I do a lot of bodies and I do a lot of embodiment, right? You could think about how they can combine together. So that's the end of this video. After this, you're going to watch the second welcome video, which works through the syllabus, works through the assignments that you have to do for the semester. And then after that, we have the third welcome video, which just thinks about Blackboard, course organization, where you actually get the content you need to consume for the course and what you actually have to do. Hopefully that made sense. Again, as always, email me if you have anything that confuses you.